Well, O.J. Simpson trial called many things, including the trial of the century. And 20 years ago, the bodies of Simpson's ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend Ron Goldman found outside of her home. Again, this is June of '94. Just 4 days later, America captivated by the scene, which you'll probably remember. O.J. Simpson leading police on a steady chase on the LA freeway. NBC interrupted Game 5 of the NBA Finals. I know, like many of you, watching the Knicks actually, right? To take that pursuit live, and more than 90 million Americans, think about that, 90 million Americans were glued to the TV. After about 90 minutes, Simpson, of course, surrendered in the driveway of his California home. We all know how it all followed from there, including figures that became famous here, from prosecutors to the defense attorneys to the famous lines of, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit, etc. But, you know, in fact, let's take a listen to the late Mr. Cochran delivering that line.
Remember these words: if it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
Well, then came the trial, of course, but then came the verdict. And when I heard the anniversary, guys, of 20 years ago to the day, we were all talking in the break about where we were, and I had a similar situation with Andrew, where we were in a location where, whether it was student union or whatever, blacks reacted one way, whites reacted the other way. You were a DA at the time, right? And you were in Mount Vernon. That must have been interesting.
It was interesting. I mean, I'm in the courthouse, and in the courthouse, a lot of people were upset about the verdict.
And people are looking at reactions 20 years ago with the verdict of it.
Absolutely.
When it came down. And, you know, and as an officer of the court, I'm curious because you maybe, did you feel there was a miscarriage of justice done? But then there was also, a lot of people felt that the system was always leaning one way, so this was maybe payback to a certain degree.
The thing that bothered me about the case was that before any evidence was adduced at all, you had people who were polarized already. You had people who believed he was innocent, people who believed he was guilty based on nothing, mostly based on what race you may have been or what your persuasion would be politically. And the thing that really stood out to me is that as a prosecutor, I saw a lot of problems with the case because the police mishandled the evidence almost every step of the way. So if I was trying a basic drug case and I had the evidence that they had in OJ and it had been handled that way, the drugs weren't secured in a locker, there were multiple people who had ability to get to the drugs, people brought some of the evidence home, I couldn't prosecute a misdemeanor case like that. So in my mind, the case should have been dismissed procedurally. I didn't get to whether I believed that he had done it. And I found that there were...
But you knew this trial, this whole thing was viewed through the prism of race.
Absolutely.
And I think for some folks, maybe not for many, but there was a little bit of a reality check, like, wow, like, this guy's my friend here, one way or the other. The two of you are buddies, and you could sit down and look at this. And like you said, from before the trial started to when the verdict came down, Andrew, it was somebody stood up and cheered and somebody put their head in their hands, like, what's going on?
Yeah, and I mean, it did seem to fall primarily along racial lines. It wasn't that surprising because everybody was so polarized from the moment it happened, it seemed, all the way through the trial. And I agree with Mayo that it seemed like people have really prejudged the whole thing. I mean, I was saying this morning, I've always looked at it as more of an issue about fame and money than about race. I think people reacted to it based on race, but I think you could speak to it certainly better than I could. If you have all of those resources at your disposal, you can mount a more adequate defense than somebody who doesn't.
Oh, absolutely. And you can look at that whether you're looking at the Kennedy trial or any time you're looking at a trial that involves someone who has celebrity and has wealth. Of course, celebrity can cut both ways. See, now before the homicide, O.J. Simpson was a beloved figure in America. So he was not like a Martha Stewart who could be somewhat polarizing. Yeah. People may like her, but people may not. And you're probably not in the middle. So for him, he had the benefit of having been loved, having been a sports hero. You know, kids grew up and they wanted his jersey, that type of thing. But then you did also have the undercurrent of him being married to a white woman in the United States. Mm-hmm. And again, as I walked out of the Mount Vernon City Court, I had people frowning at me in the deli. And I said, well, I'm not O.J. Simpson. I mean, I didn't commit any crime, so it made me feel uncomfortable.
You were already in the world of journalism when this came down here, so that had another prism to it, too.
I was in a television newsroom when it came down, and the mostly white employees of the newsroom were pissed. I mean, steaming mad. There was a loud, oh, I can't believe this. The black employees got real quiet. No one said anything. And because we knew that blacks in the street were cheering this. We were seeing live video of this. One thing I never understood, O.J. walking, is that going to put a meal on my plate? Is that going to, whether O.J. walks or is guilty, is that going to feed my family? Is that going to pay my mortgage? I know that blacks have historically felt that the criminal justice system is not for blacks. And there may be some validity to that. But I never understood why people were championing him being found not guilty.
I was surprised, Jeannie, just how clearly, in that raw, emotional, honest moment, how people felt before they calculated or whatever else. I was like, wow. We got bigger problems than many of us want to admit here. That people are looking at this with all their own personal baggage, whatever the color or the politics was, we were farther apart as a country. I just vividly remembering that when it came down. And I think, hopefully, through the tragedy of even Trayvon Martin, we've gotten a little bit closer. But I still think we always delude ourselves that, well, it's fine now. If that happened again, we'd be okay. It's still there. It's right under.
I wish that were true. I don't see that. I was at a college campus at a big public university, and it was very similar. There was a huge split. But I remember, I have to say that from my viewpoint and my vantage point, I always had a sense, and I know Mayo could speak to this much better than I could, that, we still don't understand the difference between watching something on TV like a trial and actually being there. And so I remember feeling very, very badly for the jurors in that case, and all the firsthand participants, because you cannot compare sitting through something like that in person to watching it from the outside
I'm not even
perspective.
talking about the legal, whether they got it right or wrong. It was just that naked moment of the reaction to it. And that's really what I'm focusing. Whether or not, the evidence was flawed and tainted and all that, I defer to you every time for that, Mayo. But it's just that when it came down, then it was like,
But again, going back to Jeannie's point, a lot of the people who had these strong opinions had opinions based on nothing. They hadn't even watched the trial. And even if you watch a little clip of the trial, that's not substituting for a juror who's sitting through how many weeks of trial every single day, who's assessing credibility based on things we may not see on TV. So it is unfair for us to judge juries that way, whether it's in this case or the Trayvon Martin case, anything else.
He may have gotten away with murder here, but it was about time. I heard that. I heard people saying, that's why I was saying it was more about one guy and a double murder. This was about.
But could you imagine today with Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram? I mean, this is 1994. We didn't have any of the technology we have today. Could you imagine the difference? I think it would be far worse, I'm sorry to say.
I don't know. I don't think they would put cameras in the courtroom.
Maybe not. We
saw it all play out. People were invested. I remember people that would do nothing but watch this trial all day. This made court TV. Remember that?
Right.
So, okay. When we come back, everybody, we are going to switch gears. And there was some political news, including one story that I just can't even. Al Sharpton saying people can't play the race card. That's all I have to say. Come back. We'll tell you about that after this.